Have you ever had to put a price on something you and someone else both claim, and discovered the two of you were not even using the same method to count it? Not a used car, where at least you agree on the car. Something bigger, a house you inherited together, a business you both spent years building. You do the sums one way. They do the sums a different way entirely. And you do not just end up far apart. You end up not even arguing about the same number. I am going to give you a real figure right now, before anything else, because you should have it in your head for everything that follows. 26 million pesos. That is what a Mexican labor tribunal ordered a group of foreign oil companies to pay their own workforce in the winter of 1937. The companies had 10 weeks to pay it. They did not pay it. What happened instead is a country that nationalized an entire industry, kept it, and then spent the better part of a decade negotiating what it actually owed for it. Historians are still arguing over what it was worth. Two of the best of them, writing decades apart, have put a value on the very same company so differently that their two numbers are not even close. Not 10% apart. Not double. The lowest figure on record and the highest are roughly 30 times apart. You are about to see both of their numbers. Neither of them is a mistake. Stay with me, because this is not the simple victory you may already believe, and what actually happened is more interesting than that. By the end of this video, you will know exactly what Mexico paid to take over its own oil industry. You will know why two of the most careful historians who ever studied that payment still cannot agree on what the company they paid was actually worth. And you will see in their own numbers precisely what each of them is choosing to count, and what each of them is choosing to leave out. Think of it like two appraisers looking at the same house. One prices the walls and the roof. The other prices the gold he believes is buried under the foundation. Neither of them has made an arithmetic mistake. They are simply not counting the same thing. Before any of it, what do you actually know about this story? If you have heard of it at all, you probably have some version of 3 sentences already in your head. Mexico nationalized its oil in 1938. The foreign companies fought it and lost. Mexico won and has controlled its own oil ever since. None of that is false. You can check the date. The industry is still state-owned 88 years later. But notice what your 3 sentences have in common. Every one of them describes an outcome. Not one of them tells you what the company was actually worth. And that is where the real disagreement still lives, between historians who have spent entire careers on this settlement, not between people who like what Mexico did and people who don't. If you came into this only knowing the anniversary speech version, there is nothing wrong with that. It is the version every anniversary speech tells on purpose. What winning cost and what it turned out to mean is a different question, and it is the one this video actually answers. Put yourself in Mexico City in the middle of the 1930s. The revolution that convulsed your country for a decade is not history to you. It is your parents' adult life, still close enough to touch. The Constitution it produced in 1917 already tells you the nation owns everything beneath the soil. Foreign oil companies have been operating here for decades regardless, under governments that mostly let that clause sit unenforced. Since 1934, your president has been Lázaro Cárdenas, a general of the revolution, and the man who is about to find out how much of that 1917 Constitution a government can actually enforce against companies that always assumed it never would. Here is what those companies were actually holding, and it may not be what you expect from a company about to fight this hard. Mexican oil production had fallen, year after year, from 1921 to 1933. Not because the companies stopped investing. The best available economic history of the period notes that investment actually peaked after output did. which is hard to square with companies pulling back for fear of losing the fields. That same account points instead to a geological cause: salt water invading the deposits that had already been tapped. There was one bright exception, and you should notice who held it. In 1930, the British-owned Mexican Eagle Oil Company, El Aguila, struck a major new field at Poza Rica. It was the one genuinely promising asset left in the whole country, and it belonged to the British, not the Americans. Weigh what that means for you, picturing yourself running one of the companies about to fight this hardest. On their own reported figures, the oil companies earned around $3.7 million in 1936. Strip out depreciation, and the actual cash they had to work with was closer to $7 million. Worth noting, since 26 million pesos, at the exchange rate on the eve of the expropriation, came to almost exactly the same figure. You are not looking at companies protecting a jewel. You are looking at companies with thinning margins, digging in on a fight some may genuinely have struggled to afford losing. 18th of December, 1937. Mexico's Federal Board of Conciliation and Arbitration rules for the Oil Workers Union, 26 million pesos in back wages, plus greater union say over hiring and firing. That is the figure you already have in your head from the cold open. The companies do not pay. On the 29th of December, they file an injunction with Mexico's Supreme Court asking it to throw the award out. How long do you think yourself that appeal takes to fail? 2 months, almost to the week, 10 weeks after the original award. On the 1st of March 1938, the Supreme Court ratifies it, denies the injunction outright, and sets a new deadline, the 7th of March, 11 weeks out from where this started. A labor board first, then the country's own highest court. The companies did not pay within either window. 7th of March comes and goes. On the 14th, the labor board gives the companies 1 day to respond. On the 15th, they say they cannot comply. One company closes 23 wells and starts moving stored oil toward the port at Tampico for export. The board suspends every one of their labor contracts. With no contracts and a strike already threatened, workers begin seizing terminals and shutting pipelines themselves. 18th of March, 1938. President Cárdenas goes on the radio. Listen to what he actually says his reason is. Not a declaration of economic independence. Public order, the paralysis of transport and industry, he says, threatens what he calls grave domestic disturbances, and the government has a duty to prevent them. He nationalizes the entire foreign oil industry that same night. Petróleos Mexicanos, Pemex, is created to run it, and you are about to spend the rest of this video finding out exactly what running it cost you, the country and the workers who set the whole thing in motion. 11 days past the deadline the Supreme Court itself had set, and 13 weeks after the original award. You now have the full sequence. The record itself does not tell you which of those two facts, the delay or the decree, was the plan and which was the reaction. Now the disagreement that still is not settled, the one behind the figure I dangled at the start. Two respected historians have studied this settlement in real depth, and you are about to see them genuinely disagree. Not everyone agrees, even among people who worked from the same kinds of archives, on what actually happened to the price. Start with what is not in dispute, so you know exactly where the argument actually begins. Mexico paid roughly $130 million to El Aguila alone, in nominal terms. Both historians accept that figure. Now watch this, because it is the first place the two historians actually collide. Ask what the company's own book said it was worth, and you get two different answers from two historians reading the same kind of record. One says $16.5 million. The other says $137 million. Same company, the same sort of figure, and they are more than 8 times apart before either of them has even started arguing about the settlement. One historian, Noel Morer, values El Aguila the way a stock exchange would value it for you, what investors were actually paying for its shares the year before the dispute began. He puts that market value at $12.2 million. Against the inflation-adjusted present value of what Mexico eventually paid, not the nominal $130 million, a smaller adjusted figure closer to $44 million. His multiple comes out at roughly 3.6 times the market value of the company. The other historian, Lorenzo Mayer, working from the British company's own 1938 negotiating estimate, counts something the stock exchange never priced at all, the oil still sitting underground, unlifted. That estimate put the physical plants at $76 million, and the deposits still in the ground at a further $310 million on top of that. Call it $387 million total. Against that figure, the $130 million Mexico actually paid comes out to roughly a third. Here is the sentence in Mayer's own account you are least likely to have heard anywhere else. Set the reserves aside for a moment and go back to his book value figure, the $137 million. He writes that the price Mexico paid approximated very closely that book value, the figure the company itself had declared, the year before it lost everything. Notice what that means for you, weighing the two historians against each other. Under Mayer's own numbers, Mexico did not simply improvise a settlement. It landed within 5% of the exact figure the company's own books already claimed. So which of the two starting figures would you trust, $16.5 million or $137? What a company's shares traded for, or what its own declared book said? Both historians worked from real archives. Neither made an arithmetic mistake. They started from different numbers for the same thing, and the gap between those numbers is most of the argument. You should know the other half of the settlement too, since it happened on a completely separate track from the British one you just watched. The American companies settled first. In 1940, one of them, Sinclair Oil, broke ranks and took its own deal, roughly $8 million in cash, plus 20 million barrels of Mexican crude sold to it at a discount of 25 cents a barrel below market price. Priced out, that discount added up to close to $5 million. Call the whole package worth something like $13 million. The rest held out longer than Sinclair did, until, on one historian's account, the Roosevelt administration ran out of patience with them. In April 1942, a joint American-Mexican commission, an American engineer named Morris Cook, a Mexican engineer named Manuel Zevada, delivered a formal valuation you can go and check against the published record yourself. $23,995,991 with 3% interest. Mexico credited $9 million of it to the companies immediately. And here is the lever Washington actually reached for, and it is not the oil itself. The United States, at that exact time, was taxing cheaper foreign crude to protect its own producers, so oil was not the strategic commodity you might assume. What a note from Secretary of State Cordell Hull on the 26th of March 1938. Threatened instead was Mexico's silver. Suspending the price supports the U.S. Treasury was paying for it. The Treasury itself opposed the threat and forced the State Department to soften it. One historian's reading of the episode is that the silver threat's real value to Roosevelt was leverage on his own Congress, not on Mexico at all. You should watch this negotiation closely. It ran far longer than the American one, and it did not start moving until the war changed who needed whom. Watch the two sides that opened talks in January 1947. On one side, Professor Vincent Illing, representing El Aguila. On the other, the man you already met once, Antonio Bermudez, director of Pemex itself. Illing opened at $257 million. Bermudez countered at $43.9 million. Do the arithmetic yourself, nearly 6 times apart. Here is what you need to know to understand why they ever moved toward each other at all. By 1943, Britain, weakened by the war, began working through Washington instead of pressuring Mexico directly. And Mexico, by then, needed American capital, a $10 million loan that year to build a refinery and expand Poza Rica, and talks opening in 1946 over credits potentially worth $150 million more. One historian, working from British Foreign Office files, reads Washington's willingness to keep lending to Pemex as tacitly conditioned on Mexico settling with the British first. Follow the two sides closing that gap. Illing came down and Bermudez went up to $87 million, rounded to 90, and then Mexico pulled its own offer back down to 75. Illing accepted that lower figure on one condition, that the door stayed open for El Aguila to come back to Mexico one day. Then, on the 24th of July, Bermudez raised Mexico's own offer one final time and delivered it. $81.25 million, paid over 15 years at 3%, backdated to the day of the expropriation. Signed on the 29th of August, 1947, in Bermudez's own residence. Here is the part of this story almost nobody tells you, and it is the one you should remember longest, because it answers the question you have probably already started asking yourself. In 1948, the first payment on that $81 million debt fell due. Mexico's own finances were, at that exact moment, in real trouble. And Shell, which by then controlled El Aguila, made an offer. Cancel the whole debt, they said, every dollar of it. In exchange, simply reopen talks about letting Shell back into Mexico. The government of Miguel Alemán declined. On the 18th of September 1948, it made the first payment on time and in full. Would you have taken that offer? A debt that size, forgiven, for a single conversation about the future? Think about what you would have done with Mexico's finances at that exact moment. Illing himself left Mexico still believing this was not really over. He told his own company that Pemex would eventually run short of money and expertise and would have to let Shell come back. He was still saying it in private years later. It never happened. The expropriation's first 2 years are not a clean story. Picture Mexico's position. Britain boycotted its oil outright and cut diplomatic relations. American companies pressured buyers to do the same, though one historian's assessment is that the British boycott on its own was a fairly weak instrument against an industry that was already selling more and more of its production at home. Even so, you can imagine how badly Mexico needed buyers, wherever it could find them. An independent American trader named William Davis found buyers the majors would not touch. Through 1938 and 39, Germany and Italy, and before long, Japan, ignored pressure from Standard Oil and Shell and traded manufactured goods and grain for Mexican crude. One of Davis's documented shipments sailed for Europe in July 1939 in a chartered tanker flying the British flag. By one historian's account, the oil that helped Mexico's nationalization survive its first years was bought substantially by the regimes you already know the rest of the decade was about to go to war against. The counterweight belongs here too, and you should weigh it against what you just heard. The American silver boycott genuinely hurt Mexico, something like $30 million a year in lost sales. But its two biggest losers were the Mexican Treasury and American mining companies, since most of that silver actually came out of American-managed mines. So did the Mexican state actually come out ahead financially, in your judgment, weighing everything you've seen so far? One detailed account of the period's finances says, less than you might assume. Government oil revenue did rise after nationalization, if you check the raw totals yourself. But that account attributes most of the rise to a higher tax on gasoline at the pump, not to the oil industry itself. By the same reckoning, real government revenue from oil, excluding that gasoline tax, only beat what the old companies had paid the Treasury in one of the first 8 years of state ownership. And in 1940, 2 years after you watched the government nationalize the industry, its own new oil company needed a 60 million peso subsidy from the state just to keep operating. And what about the workers, the ones whose 26 million peso award started this entire chain of events? Imagine you are one of them, still waiting to be paid 2 years on. In January 1940, the union asked Pemex to finally pay what the tribunal had ordered. According to one historian's account, drawing on a 1956 study of the industry, Pemex's own general manager accused them instead of poor discipline and removing company equipment, and Cárdenas personally intervened, asking the workers to accept a suspension of their own award until the industry could pay off its debt to the companies and modernize its equipment. Almost 3 years after the original award, that same account records a labor ruling that let Pemex fire everyone hired since the nationalization and cut the pay of anyone earning above 700 pesos a month. The working week did fall from 44 hours to 40. By 1946, real wages measured in flat 1929 pesos were lower than they had been the year before the expropriation. You would have taken home less. Adjust for the shorter working week, and the same figures come out essentially unchanged from where they started. By this account, the clearest sustained gain for workers over the period was not pay. It was a rapid expansion of the workforce itself, though those new jobs lacked the security the old ones had. You already know the part of this story that does not end in 1938, because you are living in it. You already know Pemex is still, 88 years later, entirely state-owned, because you can look it up right now. It also carries roughly $79 billion in obligations, with more than $14 billion of Mexico's most recent federal budget set aside just to service that debt. At the same time, in early 2026, Pemex cut its financial debt to an 11-year low, and production was up nearly 5% year-on-year, a company still under real financial pressure, and also, by its own recent numbers, moving in the other direction. While you were alive to see it, in 2025, Mexico's government reclassified Pemex by law from a company required to turn a profit to a public enterprise whose stated purpose is the public benefit, profitability or not. President Claudia Sheinbaum signed that decree on the 18th of March, 87 years, to the day, after Cárdenas went on the radio. Mexican press coverage of the signing noted the date itself as the 87th anniversary of the expropriation. So here is where this actually leaves you. The act itself is not in dispute. You can check every date in it. Mexico nationalized its oil on the 18th of March, 1938, 13 weeks after the original wage award and 11 days after its own Supreme Court's deadline. It paid roughly $130 million for El Aguila alone, on top of separate settlements with the American companies, and it refused an offer to walk away from that British debt for free. What is still argued by named historians in print is what the company was actually worth. Roughly a third of its total claimed value, once you count the oil still in the ground, or roughly 3.6 times its market value, priced in 1938 money, not the nominal dollars Mexico eventually paid. Once you count only what investors were paying for its shares. If you had to price a company holding rights to oil nobody had lifted yet, which number would you trust? Go back to the ledger you started with. 2 columns on the same page describing the same signed agreement. That was never a mistake in anyone's arithmetic. It is what happens when 2 historians start from different figures for the same company, one counting what its shares traded for, the other counting what still lay underground. Mexico kept the oil. Nobody argues about that part. What it actually paid for the privilege depends, to this day, on which column you choose to trust.